Assalamualaikum, my name is Anwar Muhammad Kuman Hakim Benwar. Today, I want to present about whether Agus and Shima can successfully sue Adit and company. So now I presenting on behalf of Agus. The first issue, whether Agus can sue Adit and company for the loss faced. The first element is duty of care. The history of development of this area of law since when the principle of law on duty of care was first started in 1883 in the case of Heaven against Pender, where the Court of Appeal held that if a person contract with another to use ordinary care or skill toward him or his property, that is contractual obligation and need to be considered in the context of a duty. According to James Ward, a duty of care is based on either an express or implied assumption of responsibility to exercise reasonable care when tendering advice or providing information which normally are essential in order to establish the existence of such a duty. So, the duty of care also often arises following receipt for advice or information such a request is not essential, as it suffices that advice or information has been voluntary in the circumstances where it is foreseeable that the claimant will make some financial commitment based upon its inquiry or truth. The duty is not restricted to those who carry on profession. So the application in the present case, there is duty of care on Ma'u is managing director of Bestari Berhad toward Agus, which he was consulting Agus about the investment on his company Bestari. Mark presented to consult Agus about his company, which showing the achievement of the financial strength with account statement that have been produced by the Adik company. Mark only trust the account statement produced by the Adik company have been successfully convinced Agus to invest in his company for about 100,000. Then Agus will not doubt on Mark pursuing an investment into Bestari Berhad. The action of Mark convincing Agus to invest in Bestari Berhad show that Agus has fully put trust on him, which he is managing director of the Bestari Berhad. As a conclusion, Mark have a duty of care toward Agus as his client in doing investment. Next is a negligent misstatement. Whether the negligent misstatement can be useful for Agus to sue Adik and company. The concept of duty is imposed by the law of legal duty is only the breach of this kind of duty and it resulting the damage that may give rise to liability in negligence. So the meaning of economic loss is a mean pecuniary or financial loss. Economic loss incurred as a result of physical injury or damage to property is easily recoverable.
Once it's established that the defendant owes the plaintiff a duty of care, the next step is to consider whether the defendant has breached that duty. The test to ascertain the existence of breach of duty is reasonable man test. However, another thing need to be considered is the standard expected of the defendant himself, and then to examine the action of the defendant to see whether they have fallen short of this stand. Foremost, we can assume that Audit and Company is a professional, which is an accounting body, and thus they are bound to exercise the care and skill of ordinary competent practitioners in their profession. The general rule is that defendants are expected to act with a reasonable level of skill in the activity they are undertaking. Consider the leading case of Nettleship and Western, where the defendant argued as a learner driver she should be judged against a lower standard of care. The courts rejected this and held that some who undertakes a task should be judged against the standard of a reasonably qualified, which is competent person undertaking that task. The principle of ascertaining the standard of care of a professional defendant was set out in the case of Bolam and Frian Hospital Management Committee, where the plaintiff was undergoing electroconvulsive therapy as a treatment for his mental illness. The doctor did not give any relaxant drugs and the claimant suffered a serious fracture. The claimant argued that the doctor was in breach of duty by not using the relaxant drug. However, the defendant was found not liable as he had conformed to the standard of reasonable doctors. The principle in Bolam test was followed in the case of Hor Sai Hong and University Hospital, where a baby suffered from brain defect due to the delay in receiving treatment while the mother was in the process of giving birth. The doctor was held liable under this principle as the evidence brought to the court showed that other doctors would not act like the doctor in this case. Applying in this case, Aldit and Company is considered negligent in preparing the financial position statement of Bistari Berhad because of his carelessness. As an accountant, Aldit and Company should take a reasonable standard of care to prevent any misstatement to their client, who is Mark, the managing director of Bistari Berhad. In addition, as a reasonable man, Aldit and Company have acted unreasonable care in their service as they can foresee the harm of preparing wrong statement. On the part of Agus, as a potential investor to Bistari Berhad, he could not deny the strength of Bistari Berhad financial position, as the accounts shown by Mark indicate the Bistari Berhad to be a thriving business. In essence, we can assume that Agus would not invest Rm100,000 if he knows the real situation.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Amir Zafri bin Ahmad Timzi and my ID number is 055824. And I would like to continue this presentation under the negligent misstatement. First, I would like to say that a special relationship is arise when there is an assumption of responsibility by the defendant towards the plaintiff. This in turn may be in form of the advice or services provided, and there is no longer any clear-cut distinction in the level of duty owed between the two. Pure economic loss may be incurred either as a consequence of a negligent misstatement or negligent act, for which different principles need to be considered. Okay, the negligent misstatement is a person may be held liable for statements made where reasonable reliance on that statement give rise to foreseeable financial loss for the party relying on the statement. On the case of Agus and Mark, they have special relationship, and they have special relationship based on three factors, which is first, Agus is fully trust and relying on Mark's information as he is the managing director of Bistari Berhad, and he also expertise in the Bistari Berhad. Secondly, Mark knows that Agus invests based on his representation and relies on the account statement that have shown by Mark. Thirdly, Agus has satisfied and convinced with the information given, and it would be reasonable in the circumstances for Agus on relying to the information and account statement shown by Mark. And under the application, Mark and Bistari Berhad found out that the accounting statement that produced by the Aldit and Company was carelessly prepared and faulty. As a result, the Bistari Berhad soon goes into the liquidation. According to the negligent statement, the investment made by Agus will be liable to Mark, which he was directly in track and convincing Agus relating to the faulty statement. According to the case of Hadley Briney, it was held that the defendant bank by which they employed had effectively disclaimed any assumption duty of care. Referring to this case, it was contradictory, and Mark, who was the managing director of Bistari Berhad, did not mention any disclaimer to the managing director of Bistari Berhad, did not mention any disclaimer to the Agus during signing the agreement not to be liable on any assumption of a duty of care. This shows that Mark and Bistari Berhad should be responsible on the liable on any situation that affecting their investor. Therefore, Aldit and Company, who as an accountant, the careless mistake should be avoided and should take responsible steps in order to prevent any incoming loss that might give bad effect to the company. Aldit and Company owe the duty of care toward Agus because he is a class of foreseeable user and will rely on the financial statement prepared by the company. Thus, negligent misstatement caused by Aldit and Company make he is liable to be sued. That's all from me. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Mirzamil bin Abu Bakar. I will be presenting the second issue whether Shima can sue Aldit and Company for the losses faced by her. The fact of the case that we want to discuss is Shima has invested 100,000 ringgit after receiving a copy of the prepared accounts and after approaching Rao, an employee at Aldit and Company, who advised her as to the soundness of such an investment over an evening meal. it is subsequently discovered that the accounts have been carelessly prepared by Aldit and company. Meanwhile, Bistari Berhad goes into liquidation. Shima lost her investment. So the issue arise is whether Shima can sue Aldit and company for the losses faced by her. In order to determine whether she can do it or not, the two stages test would apply. This test was founded in the case of Ants against Melton London Borough Council, where Lord Wilberforce, in his judgment, has created these two-stage tests, where firstly it must be determined whether there is a sufficient relationship of proximity or neighborhood between the alleged tortfeasor and the person who has suffered loss. It can be ascertained that the tortfeasor should have foreseen that carelessness of his part may cause damage to other party. Prima facie, a duty of care would be established. Secondly, if the answer above is in affirmative, the court then has to examine whether there are many considerations that may negate, reduce or limit the scope of the duty or the group of persons to whom the duty will be imposed. Besides the principle or the requirements of just, fair and reasonable in the case of Kaparo Industry PLC and Dickman also need to be established. While Lord Bridge has took, in his judgment, has took into consideration as to whether it is just, fair, reasonable to impose such a duty to the defendant when the plaintiff relied on the professional statement of auditors and subsequently suffered loss.
I will further explain on the breach of duty. The question is whether Aldit and company breach any duty of care towards Shima. Breach of duty is when the defendant who owes a duty of care towards the plaintiff has acted below the minimum standard of care required by him and caused the plaintiff to suffer harm. A test to determine the breach of duty is the reasonable man's test, referring to the case of Wiltshire against Essex Area Health Authority. The measurement of standard is the standard of a reasonable man. If the defendant had acted below the standard and if the defendant possesses a particular knowledge or expertise in a particular field. The reasonable man is expected to be someone possessing the same knowledge and expertise as of the defendant. Speaking about professional defendant is a person who holds some special qualifications derived from training or experience and conforms to high standard of performance and work ethics. Most of the cases, the court will imply that professional is subject to a general and basic duty to employ reasonable skill and care. The professional standard of care is and must be compared to his peers with similar skills and expertise. Causation will be continued by my friend Vinny.
Next is causation. After proving duty of care and breach of that duty, the next step is to show causation. This means that the plaintiff would have to prove negligent conduct of the defendant had caused damage to the plaintiff. It is essential in order to establish a factual link between the conduct of the defendant and the injuries of the claimant. In most cases, a simple but-for test will resolve the question of causation in tort law. In other words, the question asked is, but for the defendant's actions, would the harm have occurred? If the answer to this question is yes, then causation cannot be shown. This applies vice versa as well. The but-for test was applied in Barnett versus Chelsea and Kensington Hospital Management Committee. Mr. Barnett went to the hospital complaining of severe stomach pains and vomiting after he had drunk some tea. He was seen by a nurse who called the doctor on duty. The doctor told the nurse to send him home and call his own doctor in the morning. Mr. Barnett died 5 hours later from arsenic poisoning, which resulted in his wife suing the doctor for breach of duty. The test was applied to determine if the patient would have died but for the doctor's failure to treat the patient. Based on evidence, the court held that the hospital was not liable, as even if Mr. Barnett was admitted to the hospital, he would have still died as there was only one cure for arsenic poisoning, and it was not readily available. Had the doctor examined Mr. Barnett at the time, there would have been nothing the doctor could have done to save him. Lastly,
The application to the current case, Rao is also an employee at Aldit & Company, and he must have special knowledge or expertise to give advice in doing investments. Applying the case of Yuan Kun Yu and case of Caparo Industries PLC versus Dickman, Shima relied on the professional statement from Rao as a professional in doing investments, which showed there is a reasonable foreseeability of damage. Then, Shima's reliance on the evidence from Rao shows that there is proximity of relationship between them, or in other words, between the client and the advisor, which allows duty of care to arise. Next, pure economic loss suffered by Shima when she lost 100,000 ringgit in her investment is recoverable by applying the case of Development and Commercial Bank Berhad versus Liu Wenhang, as Shima reasonably relied on the proper performance of service provided by Rao as an investment advisor, which has helped to establish proximity and foreseeability. The negligent act of Aldit & Company affected Rao as an employee to give advice to the clients in the future, and the failure of Aldit & Company can be construed as a breach of duty, which makes him liable to be compensated for all foreseeable loss.
Applying to the matter of Shima, Rao is also an employee at Aldit & Company, and he must have special knowledge or the expertise to give advice in doing investments. Applying the case of Yuan Kun Yu and case of Caparo Industries against Dickman, Shima relied on the professional statement from Rao as a professional in doing investments, which show there is a reasonable foreseeability of damage. Then, Shima's reliance on the advices from Rao show that there is a proximity of relationship between them, or in other words, between the client and the advisor, which make duty of care would arise. Next, pure economic loss suffered by Shima when she lost 100,000 ringgit in her investments is recoverable by applying the case of Development and Commercial Bank Berhad against Liu Wenhang, as Shima reasonably relied on the proper performance of service provided by Rao as an investment advisor, which helped to establish proximity and foreseeability. The negligence act of Aldit & Company affected Rao as an employee to give advice to the clients in the future, and the failure of Aldit & Company constructed as a breach of duty, which make him liable to be compensated for all foreseeable loss. In conclusion, since Shima met all the principles of Hadley-Burn, therefore she can sue Aldit & Company for the losses that she had to face.